Hey there, and welcome to this beginner's guide to sequencing on the Ambient Zero. We'll be looking at how to use the sequencer to create, record, and perform a piece of music, which will sound like this. And along the way, we'll look at the basic features, settings, and controls of the sequencer, and I'm going to give you a couple of general purpose recipes for making and performing music of your own. Okay, so for those that don't know, a sequencer is exactly what the word makes it sound like. It's something that allows us to put notes and sounds in a sequence. You can think of it as being like a track on which you can place notes or sounds. And then the sequencer comes along like a train, and each time it hits one of the notes or sounds that you put on the track, it plays it. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of the sequencer of the Ambient Zero is that it has not just one, but 4 tracks. One for each of the layers of sound that we have. So there's one track for the drone layer, one for the pad layer, one for the Atmos layer, and one for the noise layer. And you can think of these tracks as being like 4 separate sequencers that are mostly independent of each other, except for the fact, and it's an important fact, that they're always moving in sync, parallel to one another. But we'll come back to all of that later, because to start us out here, I want to simplify things by zooming in on just one track of one layer. Let's make it the Atmos layer and put all the other tracks aside for now. And we'll look at how to use all the sequencer track features, settings, and options within that one track. And then afterwards, we'll zoom back out to look at how to use multiple tracks in conjunction with each other. And don't worry, everything we learn in one track will apply to the other tracks as well, since they all work in the same way. And then there are just a few more things to learn about playing multiple layers at the same time, and then you'll be good to go. Alright, so I'm in the Atmos layer, and for our sounds, I'm going to use the palette that I created in the previous video in the series, with the same sounds I made at the end of it, except I've made a couple of adjustments. I've turned off the delay, I've turned down the reverb so we don't have to wait as long for sounds to stop, and then I've adjusted the Atmos layer a little to make it sound a little more simple. But the other layers are going to sound the same way as they did at the end of the video. And then in each of the tracks, I've deleted all of the sequencer data that I came up with at the end of the video, and I've reverted the sequencer settings to the default ones. So I'm basically simulating what it would look like if you designed some sounds in an empty pattern palette, and we're now turning to the sequencer for the first time. Alright, so now let's do that. Let's start using the sequencer. So for the sequencer track of the layer we're in, our main buttons are this row of round ones here, which are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 16. And these represent 16 steps of our sequencer track. And we can have more or less than 16 steps, and we'll take a look at that later, but for the time being, we're just going to stick with the default 16. And one way you can think about these steps is that they're like 16 little compartments in which we can store notes and then play them back. And there are 3 different ways we can store notes inside of them, and the first one is called direct recording. And the way this works is that we simply hold down the button of the step in which we want to save a note. So let's say step 1, and then we press the key of the note we want to save to that step, and then, well, that's it. We're done. The note is now saved in that step, as indicated by the red light. The lights are off on all of the other steps because they're currently empty. So let's fill them up using the same procedure. And I'm going to do a little pattern here where I go 1 step full, next step empty, next step full, next step empty, next step full, and so forth and so on. Okay, now when I press this play button, the sequencer is going to go through these compartments one by one at a certain speed that's controlled by some settings we'll look at in a moment. And if there is a note inside one of the compartments, the note will get played. And if there's nothing inside of it, well, nothing more will get played until the sequencer gets to the next compartment. And so the sequencer is stepping through the sequence step by step, and that's why we call each of these compartments a step. Now, by default, it's going to step through the sequence at a very slow speed, as you're about to hear when I press this play button. and then I stop the sequence by pressing that play button again. And there's actually two ways of doing this. So if you just press the play button, the sound is going to stop immediately. Whereas if you hold down the function button while you do it, the sequencer will stop, but it will allow the current note to continue to play until its release time is done, which is great if you want a song to finish more gradually. So immediate stop versus gradual stop. Anyway, so that's our very, very slow sequence, and it's slow for two reasons. So first of all, we've got our beats per minute, or BPM, which is the tempo or rhythmic pulse that our sequencer is following. You can see that pulse if you look at this flashing red light right here, sort of like the heartbeat of the sequencer. And by default, the BPM is set to 80 beats per minute, as we can see if we touch this knob here, which controls our pattern palette's BPM. And we can slow this down further, all the way down to 40, which is very slow, or we can bring it all the way up to 250, which is an extremely fast tempo, faster than most punk rock and metal music. But even if we set the BPM this high and play our pattern, well, it's definitely faster, but it's still pretty slow. And that's because of the other thing that's determining how fast the sequence track gets played, which is our note value. And we access that setting by pressing Function and then this note button over here. And by default, the note value is set to the fraction 1/1. And if you scroll through the options with the value knob, you can see that we have a whole bunch of other fractions available to us, some of them bigger, some of them smaller, and then some of the fractions have a dot in front of the denominator, and some of the fractions have a T next to them. And each one of these options is essentially answering the question, how much of a measure, also known as a bar, does each step equal? Does each step equal 1 bar, 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars, or 8 bars, which is what these fractions that are equal to whole numbers are saying? Or is each step half a bar, 1/4 of a bar, 1/8 of a bar, and so on? And what is a bar in the first place? I'm sure some of you are wondering, what do these fractions actually mean? Well, in 4/4 time, which is the most common way of counting time in Western music at least, and is the one we're presupposing here, a bar is 4 beats. So I'm going to slow down our BPM to make this actually humanly countable. And so remember, this is our beat, and in 4/4 time, we count this beat as 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And each grouping of 4 beats is 1 bar. And so with our note value, if we are saying, for example, that 1 step equals 1 bar, then that means that each step is 4 beats. And if I press play again, we can count those beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and so on and so forth. And so that is why the sequencer is going so slow. If we double the fraction, so now saying that each step is 2 bars, well, now we're going to cut the speed in half, or in other words, make it twice as slow, because now we're saying that each step is 2 bars, or in other words, each step is 8 beats. And again, we can count those. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Whereas if we take our initial fraction and we cut it in half, well, now we're saying that each step equals half of a bar. And since 1 bar is 4 beats and 4 divided by 2 is 2, now we're saying that each step is 2 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So notice how I'm only getting through half of a bar. 1, 2, before I have to move to the next step and then finish the bar. 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the same logic just keeps getting extended. If we reduce the note value to 1/4, now we're saying that each step equals 1/4 of a bar. And since 1 bar is 4 beats and 4 divided by 4 is 1, well, now we're saying each step is 1 beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Cutting the fraction in half again, going from 1/4 to 1/8, would cut the length of time of each step, and therefore our sequence as a whole in half again. Now we're taking a bar of 4 beats, dividing it by 8, which means each one of our steps is going to have only half of a beat. And so now, if I'm counting, I'm going to have to count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, because it takes 2 steps to get through a beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, now I don't want to belabor the point too much, but this is pretty crucial to understanding how to use a sequencer. So just to complete this line of thought, if we cut our fraction of 1/8 in half again to 1/16, well, now everything is going to go twice as fast once again. We're saying that each step now equals only 1/16 of a bar. There are 4 beats in a bar. 4 divided by 16 is 1/4. And so each step is going to be worth 1/4 of a beat. Or in other words, it's going to take us 4 steps to get through just 1 beat. And so now we could count it 1, 2, 3, 4. Or the way we usually count it in music is 1 2 3 4 so that we have something in between the numbers. 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 and then finally, if we cut the fraction in half one more time, now we're going to go twice as fast once again. This is going to be pretty hard for me to count, but I'm going to try it. 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 and another thing to notice here is when the sequencer gets to the end of the sequence, it just goes right back to the beginning and then it loops indefinitely until you tell it to stop. Now, if all of this stuff about note values and bars and beats feels a bit overwhelming, don't worry about it too much. To make music with a sequencer, you don't have to sit there doing math and thinking, yes, 1 bar equals 4 beats divided by 32 equals yada yada yada. You just put something into the sequencer, you play it, and then if it sounds like it's going too fast, you try doubling the fraction so that it will go twice as slow. Or, let's say it sounds too slow, then just try cutting the fraction in half in order to make it go twice as fast. And speaking of simplifying all this stuff, as for the fractions with the dot in front of the denominator, those are for something called dotted notes, and the note values with the T to the right of them are for something called triplets. And remember, note values are ultimately just expressions of how much are we cutting a bar into. Is it a 16th or is it an 8th? Well, there's quite a bit of room in between an 8th and a 16th, and our dotted notes and triplet notes are just capturing fractions in between those main fractions. But if you're just starting out with this stuff, I would recommend ignoring these weirder fraction values and just stick to the more normal looking ones. So I mean the ones that reduce to whole numbers like 8, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and then the ones that go half and then just keep going in half from there. So 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, and 1/32. I would recommend just sticking with those, and those are what I use myself 98% of the time. Okay, so now I've set our note value at 1/32 again, and notice how this is now extremely fast. If I count it out, 1 2 3 4 notice how I don't even get to the end of counting a bar, which would be 1 2 3 4 before the sequence starts over. I count 1 2 and we're already at the end of the sequence, and then we start over again. And that makes sense mathematically because this is saying that we're taking our bar and we're splitting it into 32 equal-sized chunks, and each step equals one of those chunks. But right now we only have 16 steps, which is half of 32, which is the number of steps we would need now in order to get up to 1 full bar. And so if we do want a full bar of music, what we're going to have to do is increase the length of our sequence. So let's take a look at doing that next. To do this, we hold down the function button and then press this button that says length underneath it, and we see our default length of 16. Now, using the value knob, we can make this shorter if we want, 15, 14, 13, whatever we want, all the way down to 1, and notice how the lights of the steps disappear. If I play the sequence now, well, it's just one step being fired very rapidly. That's the opposite of what I want, so let's bring the length back up, And notice how as I bring the length back up, the steps reappear, so the data doesn't get lost. It's just sort of hidden out of sight, and then we can keep going with this. And we can go up to any number we want, all the way up to 64, which is the limit. And that's just one way of increasing the length. Another way is this. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to press function and then length. And then instead of using the value knob, I'm going to press the length button again while continuing to hold down the function button. And when I do that, the length is going to jump up all the way to 32. If I do it again, it'll jump up to 48. And if I do it again, it'll jump up to 64. And if I do it one more time, it'll go back down to 16. And this is useful and a good thing to keep in mind because usually you're going to want to have your sequence length be some multiple of 4. Remember, 4 beats per measure in 4/4 time. So a lot of things with sequencing revolve around the number 4. So you might have a sequence as short as 4 steps or 8 steps or 16 steps or 32 steps. Sometimes you might have 48 steps, but usually I would jump straight from 32 to 64. So in other words, you're just taking the number 4 and then doubling it over and over again. Okay, so I'm going to leave it here at 64 steps. And now we only have 16 step buttons. And 64 divided by 16 is 4. And so what the Ambient 0 does is it takes our 16 step buttons and it spreads them out over 4 pages when we're at the maximum of 64 steps. And the pages are accessed with these buttons here. And to show you this, I'm going to do something real quick without explaining it, just to make it easier for us to see. I'm going to go to the second page and I'm going to put in a pattern of 2 notes at a time this time. And notice how I'm doing that. I'm pressing down 2 steps at the same time and then pressing a key. And when you do that, the same note gets recorded onto both steps simultaneously. On page 3, I'm going to put in a pattern of 3 notes at a time, putting 3 fingers on the step buttons simultaneously and selecting a key. And then on page 4, I'm going to put in a pattern of 4 notes at a time. There's no like musical logic to what I'm doing right now. It's just so that we can see which page is which. And now I'm going to go back to page 1 and explain how the navigation actually works. So you can picture these pages as being like the pages of a book. And imagine you have the book in front of you. You have 1 page on one side, 1 page on the other side. And when we're on page 1, as we are right now, well, we have page 1 over here and we have page 2 over here. And then we can use these buttons by just tapping them once to toggle back and forth between the 2 pages. So page 1, page 2, page 1, page 2. Now, if I want to get to page 3 and 4, what I have to do is flip the pages of the book, which I do by taking one of these pages, 1 or 2, let's go back to 1, and then pressing that button again. Now we flip the page and we have page 3 here and page 4 here. And so now we can do the same thing. We can flip back and forth between page 3, page 4, page 3, page 4, page 3. And to flip back to page 1 and 2, we do the same thing. We take whichever page we're on and we press the button again, and now we're back on page 1. And then what the lights are communicating to us here is that the red light is always showing us which page are we currently on. So we're on one of these pages, which could be pages 1 or 3. When the light is green, it means that you're on the first set of pages. And then if we flip the pages, so now we have page 3 here and page 4 here, well, this button is still red, indicating we're on this side of the book, but this light turns orange to indicate that we're on the second set of pages. Okay, so that's how pages work, and one thing to keep in mind is that they only work if you have a number of steps that warrants having extra pages. If we go back to having only 16 notes, well, now pressing these buttons doesn't do anything because the page buttons have been deactivated. But let's go back to having our length be 64. Okay, now I'm genuinely curious what this is going to sound like. I have no idea since this was just for demonstration purposes. Let's check it out. Okay, not exactly my best work, but it'll do for now for demonstration purposes. A few more things I want to show you here are that, first of all, you can enter more than one note. into a step. However, if you are in monophonic mode, as I am right now, well, in monophonic mode, only one note can be played at a time. So even though multiple notes are being stored in the steps, only the most recent one that you enter is going to get played. So if I play this, we hear that new sequence that I just entered. However, if I change it to polyphonic mode, now we're going to hear both of the notes that I've entered into each of these steps. And we can enter as many notes as we want into the steps, which means that we can build up chords inside of them. Now our sequence sounds like this. Let's try slowing it down here so it sounds a little bit more reasonable. And we'll take a look at what I think is a better way of putting in chords later, but I just want to cover all of our bases with direct recording. Okay, now at this point, our sequence is a bit of a mess given all of the things that I've been demonstrating, so I'd like to clear everything and start over. So let's look at deleting notes and deleting sequences next. So if we want to delete an individual note, all we have to do is hold down the clear button and then press the step button of the step that we want to delete, like so. And notice how the light goes away since the step is now empty again. And just like you can record multiple steps simultaneously, you can also clear them simultaneously by holding down clear and pressing multiple step buttons. And by the way, you can both record and delete notes using this direct method during playback of the sequence as well. So if I press play, I can enter a note, and I can also delete notes as it goes. But I don't want to be adding notes, I want to be getting rid of all of the notes, and the way that I do that is by pressing clear, the layer that I want to delete all of the notes from the sequencer track of, so Atmos in this case, and then on the screen it says note, and that's because we have a choice here between clearing the note information from the sequencer track or clearing the sound from the layer. I'll get back to what that means in just a second, but let's just choose note and press OK, and it'll say clear, and now all the notes are gone. However, all the information about your sequence length and your note length are retained. It's just the notes that are cleared from the steps. And to show you that one more time, I'm going to put in a couple notes here. You press clear, the layer that you want to clear, and then since note is the default option, you can just go ahead and press OK if all you want to do is clear the notes. The other option is this. So imagine I make some changes to my sound that I really don't like. That sounds pretty bad. What we can do is press clear, then our Atmos layer button again, and this time choose sound, and if we press OK on this, we get reverted to the last state in which we saved the sound. And if you haven't saved anything in your pattern palette yet, then it's just going to revert you to the default state or the default sound of the layer whose sound you clear. Okay, so now that I have cleared the notes from the sequence, I'm going to reduce the length of the sequence back down to 16 using that shortcut of function and then pressing the length button again. And this time I'm going to try to put something in a little bit more melodic. And I think maybe I'll speed that up. So cutting my fraction in half from 1/8 to 1/16. And that'll do. Okay, there's one more way of extending your sequence length that I want to show you here. We start off the same way as before. We press function and then length. And then this time, instead of using the value knob by itself, I'm going to hold down the shift button while I turn the volume knob. And notice how it jumped right away to 32. And if I turn it one more time, it jumps all the way to 64. And that's because what we've done now is not just extend our sequence length to 64, but we've taken what we had on our first page and we've copied it to the next page, and the next page, and the next page. So this is a way of taking a shorter sequence and then duplicating it. And initially, if you start with 16 and you duplicate it, it doubles it, so it goes from 16 to 32, and then if you keep going with the volume knob, you're taking that 32 and then duplicating it one more time, and 32 times 2 equals 64. Okay, so now we have 4 versions of the same exact sequence. Why would we want such a thing? Well, because what that allows us to do is we can now take this same idea and on each of the pages, we can make little variations to it. For example, on the second page, maybe I'll delete the first note, and then instead of going here, I'm going to go down here. So I'll put that in. And then on the third page, I'll delete the first note again. And this time, instead of going here or going here, I'm going to drop down to here. And then on the fourth page, I'll do the same thing, delete the first note, and this time I'm going to put in this note. So I have this little pattern now going on with the first note of each page where I go. And so now our whole sequence across the 64 steps and the 4 pages sounds like this. And so this can be a nice way of combining repetition with variety, which is one of the most basic ways of making music that's both interesting and memorable and evocative sounding. You repeat an idea in order to sort of lodge it in people's minds, but then you make little variations on it to prevent it from getting too repetitive and boring. Okay, and then one last thing I want to show you before we move on to the next recording method is that when we have notes spilling across onto multiple pages and we press play, well, first of all, notice how there's that light that shows us our current spot and our progress through the sequence. And then also notice how when we get to the second page, as we're on right now, the sequencer automatically flips to the page that we're on so that light can continue to keep track of where we're at. Flip the page. Flip the page again. Now, often that's a great feature. It helps us to keep track of where we're at. But let's say you're in the middle of performing some music or recording some music live and you want to make some tweaks to one of these pages. For example, maybe you want to delete a note and put in a different note while it's in the middle of playing. That can be hard to do if the pages keep flipping on you. So something you can do is while the sequencer is playing, if you press these page buttons, the pages will get locked in place. Let me show you that. Press the button. Okay, so now we're still on page 1. Notice how this light is flashing here to let us know that the sequencer is currently on a different page. And then we get back to the page 1, and so forth and so on. So now I can make changes to this page if I want to. And then when I want it to end, when I want the page locking to end, I just press the OK button. And now we're back to the pages automatically flipping. Okay, so now we've seen one method of recording notes, direct recording. And the advantage of it is that, well, like the name says, it's very direct and simple. You just press a step and press a key, and you're done. But it can also be a little bit cumbersome because you do have to hold down the step buttons while you press the keys simultaneously, and there are some other limitations to it as well. And that brings us to our next method of recording, which is step recording. So to show you this, I'm going to clear the sequence real quick, pressing OK to clearing the note. And now I'm going to come over to this button here that has the recording symbol on it, and I'm going to press it. And when this light is red, it can also be orange, but we're going to come back to that later. So when it is red, as opposed to off or orange, and when our play button is off, because this can also be on at the same time. So when this button is red and this is off, we are in step recording mode. And you can see this blinking light here on the step buttons, and that's a lot of what this recording mode is all about. With this recording mode, we just press a step, and then this blinking light indicates that that's the step that we're currently in, and then we can just record a note or notes without having to hold down the step button. Now, what happens next after we've done that is going to depend on how we have another setting set up. And to access this setting, I'm going to press Function, and then this button here that says System at the bottom, and I'm going to keep pressing that System button until we get to this option called Auto Step. And then it flashes for a moment, and then it moves on to the options for the setting, which are on or off. So to repeat that again, press the System button until it says Auto Step, and then wait a second. you'll get the options, and then you can choose between on and off. Now with auto step off, what's going to happen is when I record a note onto the sequencer in step recording mode, we stay in that step and we continue to hear the note. The note gets held, which can be very useful if we are in polyphonic mode and we're trying to build up a chord. But let's say I press the wrong note. Ooh, that sounds terrible. Well, I don't have to delete and redo everything. What I can do is I can just go back in, press that note again, and when you press a key of a note that's already recorded to a step, the note will get removed. So we go from this, and now we're good again. So we continue to stay in the step until we press another step button. So let's go back to where we were. If I want to go to step 3, I just press the step 3 button, and now I can start building up another chord over here. Go to step 5, doesn't have to be a chord, I could just put a single note in. Step 7, 9, 10, and so forth and so on. And if at any time you want to go back and hear what you had in an individual step, all you have to do is, when you're in step recording, just press the button of the step that you want to hear. It can be very useful for reviewing what you've done, making little tweaks to it, finding where in a sequence you made a mistake, and things like that. Now I'm going to clear this pattern again to show you our other option here with auto step, which is to have auto step on. And with auto step on, what's going to happen is when I record a note or a group of notes, the sequencer is going to automatically step to the next step. And then if I put a note in there, it'll do the same thing again, and so forth and so on. So let me actually do that now. And so that can be very useful if you're trying to quickly build up a melodic line. And that didn't sound very great because remember, we're in polyphonic mode, and the same rules that we went over in the sound design video apply to this as well. If we're in polyphonic mode and we have a long release, as we do now, the notes are going to bleed into each other. So let me turn down our release. And now that sounds better. This is a bit of a side note, but I think an important one. Your release values and your attack values really play a huge role in how a sequence is going to sound, and it can also be a nice performance effect to change the release and attack values as a sequence gets played. So just something to keep in mind whenever you're making sequences. All right, anyway, even though we have auto step on right now, we can still move to whatever step we want by pressing the step buttons. And you can also move between steps by using the volume knob. Okay, let me clear that again and show you one more big advantage of step recording mode, which is that we can record one note or a group of notes across multiple steps. And the way that we do that is we first select the step where we want the note or group of notes to start. Let's make it step 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down some keys. Let's just make it a group of notes, a chord for demonstration purposes. And then I'm going to keep my fingers held down on the keys, and I'm going to go to the step where I want it to end in the sequence. Let's say step 8. And now you can see those two flashing lights. That's showing us where the notes are going to be spread. And if I let go of the keys now, all of those steps get filled with that chord. And then because we have auto step on, it jumps to the next step. And so now I can do the same thing. I can put in a different chord. Hold down the keys, I'm not letting go. I go up to step 16, and now when I let go of the keys, it's going to spread the notes all over this span here, indicated by the flashing lights. And then because we had auto step on, it automatically jumped to the next step, which since we were at the end of the sequence, meant we looped all the way back to the first step, and then we started hearing it again. Okay, so now if we play this sequence, it's going to sound like this. Now notice what's going on here. It's the same chord from steps 1 to 8, but in each step, it's playing it as a new instance of that chord. And that brings us to another option we have, which is our tie option, which is the secondary function of this button here. So if I hold down the function button, you can see that this light is off on this button, and that means that the tie function is currently turned off. If I press the button, the light goes red to show that tie is now on. And what this is going to do is when I enter notes in the way that I just showed you before, so let's clear what we currently have and go into step recording mode, put in that first chord from step 1 to step 8, and then the second chord from step 9. Remember, as soon as I let go, it's going to loop back to step 1 since we're at the end of the sequence. Okay, now if I press play, the sequencer has tied together the notes that I entered across all 8 steps. And so this can be very useful for things like chord progressions, where you usually want chords to last for longer than one step. And it can also be useful for melodies because it allows you to have more rhythmic variation with the notes that make up the melody. So for example, let's clear this yet again. We could have something where we start off with some short notes, and now I'm going to do a longer note. Let's do 2 more short notes. Then a note that's a bit longer, but only half as long as that long note as before. So I'm just going to tie it across these 2 steps here. And then let's do 4 short notes once again. I don't know if this is actually going to sound nice because it's very hard to come up with a melody and talk at the same time. Let's check it out. Again, not my best work, but I think that gives you an idea. Speaking of rhythmic variation, remember that you don't have to fill every single step with a note. And in fact, if you're doing a more melodic sequence, often you don't want to fill up every single step. You want some pauses in between some of them. So I'm just going to randomly add some pauses. And if I don't like that, I can always make additions. This is a place where direct recording might come in handy. Maybe I just want to try adding a note in real quick and then delete another note real quick. Let's try that. And that's sounding a little better already. And a lot of the process of coming up with a melody on a sequencer is just trial and error and iteration like that. It's very rare that I have a perfectly formed melody already in my head. It often starts off sounding pretty bad, and then I gradually make it better and better. Okay, so that is the tie function. And one thing to keep in mind with it real quick, if I delete our note sequence again, is that you can tie as long as you want. In fact, if you have the length set at the maximum of 64, you can tie all the way from the beginning to the end of the 64-step sequence by selecting step 1, and then I'm going to hold down a key, and then use the page buttons to navigate to page 4 and the final step, still holding down the key. That's the crucial bit. If you let go, this doesn't work. And now this light's flashing to let me know this is going to be the end of the sequence, and if I let go, sure enough, I've filled up the entire sequence with that single note. So you can do that. However, if I delete that and go back to page 4 and go to the final step, the one thing you can't do is you can't tie from the end of a sequence to the beginning of a sequence. So if I try to go from this last step and then navigate to the first page and the first step of the first page, well, the light's blinking. It looks like it's going to work, but it's not going to go from step 64 to step 1. Instead, it's going to assume I made a mistake and that what I actually wanted was to go from step 1 all the way to step 64. And so the rule here is that the beginning of the sequence is always the beginning of the sequence, and the end of the sequence is always the end of the sequence. Notes can spill over from one page to the next when we're talking about page 1 and page 2, or page 3 to page 4, but you can't spill over from page 4 back to page 1. Okay, and then one other thing to point out with tied notes, if we go back to that method of deleting notes that we looked at with direct recording, where I press clear and then I press one of the steps, that step gets deleted, but our tie gets maintained. If I play this, now this is treated as one single note segment, and then the rest of this is treated as one single note segment. It's going to be a fun way of coming up with rhythms randomly, delete notes willy-nilly. And let's hear what that sounds like. And I can keep segmenting these notes however much I want by pressing clear and one of the step buttons. However, if we go back into step recording mode and I press clear and one of the notes, well, now it deletes the entire segment. And so you can delete notes while you're inside of step recording by holding down the clear button and then the step, just like before, but just be aware that in step recording mode, these tied together notes will be treated as one unit, and so therefore if you delete any part of the segment, it'll delete the entire segment, like so. Whereas outside of step recording mode, you're just deleting the step that you press. That can be very useful because let's say you're in step recording mode and you put something in, and you accidentally go one step too far. Well, rather than having to redo the whole thing, now you can just go back and snip off the extra little bit. Okay, so that's step recording, and its big advantage is that it allows you to slowly, reflectively, deliberately, and analytically create a sequence of notes. You can really sit there and think, okay, here's what I want for step 1. And then for step 2, I'm thinking this, and then for step 3, and so on and so forth. And that's good and all, but it can also be kind of difficult to do. If you know how to play the keyboard live, even just a little bit, it can often be easier to just play something than to sit there and think, okay, so that first note I was playing, I think that was maybe 2 steps long, and then that can be pretty hard to do. Because when you're playing the keyboard, you're doing it in a more sort of intuitive way that relies on muscle memory and just going with the flow of something. It's all just sort of flowing out of your fingers. And it can be really, really hard to translate from that one mode of coming up with music, that really intuitive one, to that much more analytical one, which step recording lends itself to. And that brings us to our third and final note recording method, live recording. And to access this is very simple. We're just going to press the recording button and then press the play button, and that's it. Now we're in live recording mode. You can also, at any time during playback, press the recording button, and now you're in live recording mode as well. Now, when you have just a blank canvas like this, it can be very hard to record something with any sense of rhythm, and so it's going to really help if we turn on the metronome, which we do by pressing function, and then this button here with the metronome icon below it. We have a choice between turning it on or off, which we can toggle between by pressing the button over and over again. And then over here, you can see with the label here, we have the metronome icon, and then connected to it is the word setting. Here we can control the settings for our metronome. So function, then this button. And here we can set the volume, or if we press that button again, we can choose to have a pre-count. So volume is pretty self-explanatory. We can make the volume of our metronome louder or quieter. Here it is at 4. And listen to that beat and look at the flash. The beat is following that flash because that is our beat. This is showing us our beats per minute, and the metronome is sounding them out. Okay, so that's the volume, which you can raise or lower. And then if we press that setting button again, toggling between the different options by pressing the button repeatedly, we also have an option for having a pre-count, which is set to off by default. But we also have options of 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 8. I'm going to set it at 4. And what this is going to do is when I press the record button and then the play button to enter live recording mode, it's going to give me a pre-count of 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I record. And that way I can press the buttons here and get my fingers in place and ready on the keyboard. So let's give this a shot. Okay, so it keeps looping, and as it loops, I can keep on adding to it and treat this almost like a looper. So let's do that again. So this can be another way of building up a pattern. And even if you're not skilled enough at the keyboard to play lots of different notes at the same time, well, thanks to this kind of looping ability, you don't have to. You can build it up one line at a time and gradually make it more and more complex and sophisticated. Another option we have here is instead of just pressing this button by itself and making it go red, if we hold down the function button and then press this button, it'll turn orange. And that means it's in overwrite mode, which is the word that's right below the button here. And in overwrite mode, what's going to happen is as I record notes to the sequencer, they're going to overwrite the ones that are already there. So let me show you that. And this way you can evolve a sequence during a live performance or live recording. Now I'm going to clear this yet again to show you another thing. How live recording works also depends on whether you have tie on or off. When I have tie off and I record notes in either normal recording mode or overwrite mode, so I'm going to do that real quick. I'm just going to hold down a note and watch what happens. So even though I'm holding down the note, it only gets recorded onto one step, the step in which I began to hold down the key. So if I do that again and I wait, I'm still holding it down, but it only recorded in step 8, which was when I began to hold it down. Now that's with tie off. If we turn tie on, now when I hold down the keys, they're going to be spread out for as long as I hold them down. And just like in step recording mode, you can hold and spread for as long as you want. So we could even do the entire sequence. However, just like in step recording mode, you can't continue to tie from the end of the sequence back to the beginning. So for example, so we continue to hear the chord because I'm holding down the keys, but it only gets recorded onto the final steps. And then when we reach the end of the sequence, the recording stops. Because this goes back to that thing I said about the end of the sequence is always the end, the beginning is always the beginning. So that is a limitation to be aware of. And I've got some other tips and tricks for recording live, but I don't know how interesting this is going to be for anyone because I don't know how many of you want to be able to record live, since it does require that you know how to play the keyboard a little bit. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more, and maybe I could make a follow-up video on the topic. But in the meantime, I think the most important things to take away from this are the differences between having tie on and tie off and overwrite on and off, and the practical implications, advantages, and use cases for those different options. If you have tie off, that could be really great for short punctuated melodies where you only want one note per step. That was way easier to do than it would have been if I had tie on, because with tie on, I'm going to have to be much more precise with my playing. If I go back into step recording mode, I can see that I sometimes played a note too long. I was trying to keep it to just one step, but it spilled over into the second step, and now those two steps are tied together. Whereas with tie off, even if you hold down one of the keys for too long, it's only going to record it in one step. And that could also be very useful in overwrite mode. Let's say we have a chord, and I'm just going to spread and tie it across the entire sequence. Okay, if I just want to punctuate this chord with little stabs of notes, well then I want to turn tie off and then put overwrite on by pressing function and the record button. Notice how I had to adjust the release to make it sound a little bit more distinct, otherwise the notes bleed into each other. Whereas, let's turn tie back on, record a chord across the whole sequence again. If I want to replace this whole thing using overwrite mode during live playback, well, now I do want tie on. Let's demonstrate that. Okay, so those are all of our options for recording notes onto a sequencer track, and I'll leave it at that for note recording, which is really at the core of sequencing, and that's why I've spent so much time on it. All right, now moving on. Another thing I want to show you with the sequencer has to do with how sequences get played back. So far we've just been pressing the play button, and then the sequencer is just going through our sequence exactly the way we put it in. Now, we have a few options for mixing things up here a bit. The first one is our transposition or transpose option, which is over here. So press function and then this button. And with this, what we can do is we can take our sequence and we can transpose it up anywhere between 1 and 12 semitones, or we can go down -1 to -12 semitones. And then these values wrap back around. So if I go left just one more time, we're back up to 12, and then we can go back down, and 0 is the neutral point. Now, what is a semitone? Some of you might be wondering. A semitone is just as you go across the keyboard and play it chromatically. So in other words, you go. Each one of those little steps is a semitone, and between this C and this C, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 semitones. And so if we want to raise this entire sequence up an octave, so this is the way it sounds right now, all we need to do is go to transpose and transpose it up 12 semitones. Or we can transpose it down -12 semitones, and that'll be an octave lower. And you can go anywhere in between, +7 for example. And what you're essentially doing here is you're transposing your music into a different key, and this can be a useful way of experimenting with other keys. It's especially useful if you only know how to play what would be the white keys on the keyboard, which give you the musical keys of the key of C major and A minor, C major being A minor being. You have to play what would be the black keys on a normal keyboard or piano in order to play other keys. This requires some memorization of the keyboard, but with transposition, you don't have to memorize anything. You can just start in C and then transpose to another key using transposition. And putting that aside though, another really useful thing about this is that because you can transpose up or down an octave, well, let's say, for example, we go back to having this at 0. We have this getting played, and I'm happy with it by itself, but then when I'm in my pad layer and I have, let's say, some chords going on, well, maybe I'll suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, I like having the pad layer in this part of our overall octave range, but this is now sounding a little bit too low, a little bit too close to that octave range of the pad layer. I wish I could raise it up an octave. Well, thanks to transposition, you can do that very easily. You don't have to redo your entire sequence. You can just transpose. So that's a very useful feature. It's something I'm constantly using because I'm a dummy who always puts things in the wrong octave initially, but I'm going to put this back to 0 now. Okay, so that's transposition. And then the two other big options that we have for mixing things up more with our playback are probability and randomization, which are controlled by this knob and these buttons here. They're similar in some ways, but also different. So let's go through them one by one. Let's start with probability. This is something we actually looked at in the very first video of this series in conjunction with the arpeggiator voice mode. And it works in a very similar way with the sequencer as well. So this is a secondary function of this knob. I'm going to put on a shift hold. And by default, our probability is set at 100. But if I move it down to 50, let's say, well, now what's going to happen is as the sequencer goes through our sequence, each note in each step is going to only have a 50% chance of getting played. Or in other words, there's a 50% chance of the note getting skipped. And so now each pass through the sequence is going to be a little bit different than the previous one. There are always going to be little variations. And different probabilities will give you different results. If you bring it closer to 75, then you're going to hear the notes more often. If you bring it all the way down to 25, which is the minimum possibility, now we're going to hear much fewer notes. I'm going to bring back the probability to 100 for now. And now let's look at randomization. This first button here is the random sequence button. And so I'm going to hold down function and press that button, and we can toggle it between on and off by just pressing the button over and over again. If I turn it on, what I'm telling the sequencer is if there is any randomization on any of the layers, any of the sequencer tracks, I want you to use that randomization setting. And that randomization setting is controlled by this next button over here called random step. So I'm going to press this function, then this button, and this is set to off by default. But if we keep pressing it, we have options of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. So I'm going to set it at 4 with randomization on and with our randomization step set to 4. What we're telling the sequencer is that we want it to split our sequence, in this case of 16 steps, into chunks of 4. It's going to split our sequence into a chunk of steps 1 to 4, steps 5 to 8, steps 9 to 12, and steps 13 to 16. And then when I press play, it's going to randomly choose one of those 4 chunks. Let's say it goes to chunk 5 through 8 first. So this is our initial chunk. It's going to play through the entire chunk. And then when it gets to the end, it's going to randomly select another chunk. And that chunk could be any of the 4 chunks. It could go over here to chunks 1 to 4. It could go over here to chunks 13 to 16. Could go to the next chunk of 9 to 12. Could even repeat the same chunk again. And it's just going to be random. So to show you this, I am going to make this go a bit slower by reducing this to, let's do quarter notes, and let's watch what happens. I'm going to try to use my fingers to indicate which chunk we're on as the sequencer goes and as it randomly chooses between the chunks. Okay, so that was with our randomization step option set to 4. If we set it to 8, now it's going to split our entire sequence into chunks of 8. So 8 here, and randomly go back and forth between them. (16) would mean our entire page of steps would be treated as one chunk. And so if we had multiple pages, we could essentially randomize each page. And then we can bring this down all the way to 1. And now it's going to be treating the steps as chunks of 1. Or in other words, each step is going to be the unit of randomization. And so we're just going to randomly hop all over the place. Okay, so that's randomizing things in this particular sequencer track, and the randomization is on because we have a randomization step selected and because we turned randomize on. Now, if we go over to another layer, well, randomization sequence is still on. As we can see, if we hold down the function button and look at the light's on, indicating that it's on. However, because the randomization step option is set to off in this layer wouldn't get randomized. And so that's what I meant earlier when I said the randomization sequence option, which is either on or off, is controlling whether there's any randomization going on in any of the sequencer tracks. This is a global setting, as indicated by the fact that it has an empty background, whereas randomization step is a layer-specific setting. It could be off in this layer, and it could be 1 in this layer, and the fact that it's a layer specific setting is indicated by it having this white gray label background, as all of these buttons do and as these knobs do, but this knob doesn't because that's another global level parameter. So anyway, point being, the practical implication of this is this way you can have some layers be randomized and others not be randomized, and you can also turn randomization on or off on all of the layers by simply turning random sequence on or off. Okay, and then the last thing to tell you about here is that you can combine the randomization of the steps with the probability, and that's going to make this even less predictable. So let's turn our probability to 50, for example, and now we're going to be randomly jumping around in steps of 1, but sometimes notes will get played and sometimes they won't. And one thing to keep in mind is the randomization is randomizing the chance of an individual note being played. And so if I have multiple notes in a step, or in other words, a chord, as I do in some of these steps, well, each of those notes has a 50% chance of getting played. And that's why we're hearing so many notes, because a lot of the steps have multiple notes inside of them, and so there's multiple chances of them getting played. If we replace this sequence with a monophonic melody line, change over to monophonic mode and just put something in real quick. Now we're going to hear notes a lot less often. And now that we have those long gaps of silence in between our notes, well, that may or may not be something desirable, depends on the song we're making, but if you don't want it, well, something you can do here is increase your release so that the notes linger around longer and they fill up those silences in between the new notes being played. And again, we can reduce the probability all the way down to 25. And when you have fewer notes being played, it also gives you an opportunity to increase the speed of the notes. Let's bring this up from quarter notes to an eighth note without the playback getting too overcrowded, since so many notes are now getting skipped. So let's listen to that. I think we could even increase this one more time by cutting our fraction in half once more and going to 16th notes. Let's try that. Now, I may or may not be happy with that depending on the context of the song. Let's say I'm not happy with it. Let's say I like that speed of the playback of the notes, but I wish it was a little less busy. I wish the notes were getting played a little less often. And the thing is, well, I can't go below 25% probability. That's a hard limit. However, what we can do here is we can take the length of our sequence and increase it a little bit. Let's try, 24. Okay, so now we have all these notes on the first page. But over on the second page, we have these empty steps, and I'm just going to leave them empty. And since we're randomizing with steps of 1, well, every time we go to a new step, there's a chance that the sequencer is going to go to one of these empty steps. There's also a chance it'll go to one of these steps that is full, but in that case, there's only a 25% chance of it getting played. And so since there's a 25% chance of these getting played and a 100% chance of nothing getting played if one of these steps gets played, our overall probability is going to go below 25%. And if I want it even less busy, well, I can just increase the length some more. So let's try that. Let's go all the way to 32. And this may seem a bit too random in isolation, and I would agree, it's not like super fun to listen to by itself, but if you combine it with stuff going on in the other layers, like let's have a drone going on, and a chord, and then play it, well, now you're on your way to an actual ambient song. And then one thing to keep in mind with all of the options that I just showed you for playback is that these can be changed in the middle of playing. So I can start playing this, and I can modify the probability. I can modify the randomization step. I can modify the length of the sequence. I can turn randomization off. And I can transpose. Start messing with the release. Any randomization back on. Decrease the probability. Increase the release again. Point being, there's all sorts of stuff you can explore just in this super simple sequence that I've come up with. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is what happened with the transposition. So let me slow down this sequence so it's easier to keep track of. And let's turn off randomization, turn probability all the way up. So I'm going to start playing our sequence. And actually, let's make it even slower. Okay, I'm going to change the transposition right now. But notice how it doesn't go into effect right away. It waits for the sequence to end, and then it goes into effect, which is actually a really good thing because otherwise you'd have to worry about picking up all these weird semitone intervals in between, which usually you don't want. So yeah, transposition can be used both as a performance effect and as a composition tool for when you mess up and realize that you wish you'd put something in a different octave. All right, so those are the playback options that we have available to us. I am going to undo the transposition, and I'm going to put in a new sequence here. Let's do something like... And let's speed this up a bit. Okay, that'll do. And now what I want to show you is another big topic with the sequencer, which is parameter locking. But as you're going to see, there are a lot of things with this that are analogous to what we looked at with note recording, so this is going to be quicker and easier to go through. So with parameter locking, exactly like the name makes it sound like, we can take any of our steps and almost any of our parameters and lock those parameters at certain values on different steps. And what exactly I mean by that will become more clear in just a moment, but first let me just show you how it works and then I'll explain more. And to use parameter locking, first of all, you have to make sure that the parameter locking function is on. That's controlled with this button here, which is labeled parameter lock on top. When this button is green, parameter locking is on. And if it's not on, well, you can toggle between the different options by just pressing the button repeatedly. It goes green, orange, and off. When it's off, parameter locking is off. When it's green, it's on. And when it's orange, well, that's something else that we're gonna come back to later. So I'm gonna set it at green, and now we have parameter locking on. Okay, so just like with note recording, there are a few different ways of doing parameter locking. And the first one is similar to direct recording. You just hold down the step that you want to parameter lock. And then this time, instead of pressing a note key, I'm gonna turn one of the parameters while continuing to hold down the step that I want to lock that parameter on. I'm gonna do this with the filter cutoff just for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to set it at a pretty low level. And notice again how I was holding down the step the entire time. You have to continue holding it down for this to work. And then as you turn the knob, wherever you leave the knob at the end and then let go of the step, that is going to be the value that gets locked onto this step. So right now, step 1 has parameter locking for filter cutoff, and it's locked to a filter cutoff value of 21. Now I'm going to go through the next 7 steps up to step 8 and do a similar thing, locking the filter cutoff on different steps at various fairly low levels. Now, if I touch the filter knob without holding down any of these step buttons, you can see that our current value is 48. So 48 is the value that I've set the filter cutoff at for the Atmos layer as a whole. And so you can think of this as sort of being like the default value that we currently have this layer set to. However, if we now play our sequence, those low parameter values that we've locked onto these first 8 steps override the more global level 48 that we've set for the layer as a whole. And I can change this more global level parameter value however I want. For example, I could raise it all the way up. And that is going to affect these 8 steps here that I haven't done any parameter locking on. However, once again, because there's parameter locking on these first 8 steps, those locked parameter values are going to overwrite whatever I say up here, whatever I do on the layer as a whole. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit, and then I'm going to go back to these steps, and we can lock however many parameters we want. For example, I'm going to go through these first 8, and I'm going to put in different filter resonance values. So I'm just going through, holding one step down at a time, and then wiggling the filter resonance knob. And then once again, I can have the filter cutoff value and the resonance value wherever I want for the layer as a whole, and that is going to affect these 8 steps, but it's not going to affect these 8 because these 8 have been locked in respect to these 2 parameters. And I don't want to belabor the point too much, but we can keep going with that. We could lock our shimmer reverb parameter values onto these first 8 steps. Let's try doing that. We could even come up to these red knobs and lock any of them onto these steps, except for the structure. You can't change structures, but you can change any of the other ones, including wavetable. So we could actually switch wavetables from one step to the next. Let's try doing that. Holding down step 1, let's make our first step a saw wavetable, second step a square, third a sine wave, triangle wave, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure this is going to sound completely crazy, but just to drive home the point, let's play this. But again, just like with anything else, let's say I decide I want the layer as a whole to be this wavetable. Well, these steps over here are going to be that wavetable, but these steps over here are locked to the other wavetables. So that global level change I make in the wavetable won't affect the parameter locked steps, the steps that have parameter locking on them. However, if I take another parameter, like let's say our feedback parameter, because this Atmos layer is set to the second Atmos structure. Let's increase the feedback. Now, because I haven't locked any feedback parameter data to any of the steps, this change will affect all of them. So if I didn't want it to affect some of them, let's say the first 4 steps, well, I could hold down all 4 steps, put on a shift hold, and parameter lock those 4 steps to having the feedback value to 0. And so now it'll be 0 on those 4 steps, but then it'll go back to whatever I set it globally with the knob up here while I'm not holding down any of the step buttons. Okay, now if you want to clear any of that parameter locking data at any time, you have 2 options. One is you can hold down function and then press this parameter lock button to make it go red, which means a few things that we'll get into later. But for right now, what I want to show you is that if this button is red and we press the clear button, then the steps that have parameter locking data on them are going to flash. So we can see those first 8 steps flashing, whereas the second 8 are not flashing. And then if, while continuing to hold down clear, I press one of the step buttons, like step number 8, we'll notice how it stopped flashing, and I let go. The note is still there, but the parameter locking data has been deleted. And so now I can go back and it's just randomly deleted on some of the steps, hear what that sounds like. Okay, now to make this go back to green, you just start pressing the button again. And then if we want to delete all of the parameter locking data at the same time, then we can just press clear and then this parameter lock button. Like that, you'll see clear on the screen. And if I play the sequence, now the global level settings that I've put in place for this layer are the only ones that we're hearing. So if I bring back the feedback, for example, now it's gone for all of the steps, and I can start over with parameter locking. And so this enables you to very easily experiment, try something out, see if you like it. If you don't, delete it, try again. Now, just like with direct note recording, the advantage of this method, where we hold down a step and then wiggle one of the knobs around, is that it's very direct and simple. But the disadvantage is that you can't really hear what's going on while you do it, unless you record a note and record some parameter locking data at the same time. But personally, that's too many things for my brain to handle simultaneously. And so that brings us to another way of recording parameter locking data, which is to go into step recording mode and then press function and press the parameter lock button to make it go red. And now we'll see another aspect of what this being red is all about. When the button is red, we're in parameter recording mode. And when we're in step recording mode, the way this will work is I can go to any step, just like I normally can in step recording mode. And then if I make a change to one of the parameters, that change is going to be saved to the step in which I make it. So now if I play our sequence, you can hear the filter cutoff suddenly drop on that step. And then we can go around and make whatever changes we want and hear them as we make them. Bit of a weird clucking sound on that 9th step, I think. So I'm going to go back into parameter recording mode and step recording mode, and let's try adjusting that a bit. I think the resonance is a bit too high. Let's try that again. And so yeah, you can make adjustments that way as well. And then another way that we have of recording parameter lock data is if we have this button red and we play the sequence, while it's playing, we can make changes with the parameters, and those changes will be recorded onto the steps as the sequencer goes across them. And we can do this with any parameters we want. We can also do it with the red knob parameters as well. And so you can get some very glitchy stuff going on this way. One thing to keep in mind though is that when you're recording parameter locking data in live playback mode, you're not recording the movement or the motion of your parameter changes. Instead, the sequencer is just going through the sequence step by step. And wherever you happen to have a knob, let's say, for example, our filter cutoff, if I have it at 22 at the very last moment that it's in step 11, for example, well then a filter cutoff value of 22 is going to be locked onto that step. And if a second before that with step 10, if the last value that I had it on was 33, well 33 is going to be what gets recorded to this step. And then when we play back the sequence, it's going to jump from 33 to 22. And that's what's going to happen if I'm fast with my parameter changes, because it's not recording the motion, it's just recording what is the last state of the step before the step is ending. How has the parameter been changed? What is the current number that it's at? And so if you want a glitchy effect, like we just did, well, you don't have to worry about that because you're trying on purpose to just like move things around in a kind of choppy way. But if you want a smoother change from one step to another, one that mimics something more like a triangle wave LFO or something like that, well, then you're going to have to go very slowly and gradually from one step to another. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to clear all of the parameter locking data, and 16 steps isn't much to work with here. So I'm going to clear this pattern and let's do a longer one. I'm going to increase the length of our sequence to 64 and let's just put in a chord. So switching to polyphonic mode, I'm going to tie a single chord across the entire sequence. And it's very quiet because we have the filter cutoff set low for the layer as a whole. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to gradually, very slowly and gradually bring the filter cutoff value up. When I get to about the halfway point in the sequence, then I'm going to start going back down, and I'm going to try to time things so that when I get to the final step on page 4, I'm back down to my initial value, so that then when we loop back to the beginning of the entire sequence, we're back where we started. And so it's going to act sort of like an LFO going up and down continuously. So let's give this a try. Okay, so it wasn't perfect, but I think you get the idea. And by doing this, what you can do is you can effectively create sort of a manual version of an LFO. And since you can do this with multiple parameter values, well, this gives you even more modulation options because you have your two actual LFOs. You have the modulator that's basically a simplified LFO, and then you have parameter locking that's acting like an LFO on the sequencer. Okay, now I'm going to clear that sequence, and actually maybe I should point out that even though I've cleared our note values, if I hold down the clear button, you can see all those steps blinking. The parameter data is still there. And that can actually be useful because, like I said, you can use this as an additional LFO. And so this enables you to use this additional LFO. It's not really an LFO, but it acts like one in conjunction with playing the keyboard live. So let me demonstrate that real quick. And if I want the LFO to go faster, well, I can just make the sequencer go faster by increasing the speed by cutting the note value fraction in half. So now each step is a 30-second note, and our LFO style sequence will go twice as fast. And if you combine this with a bunch of other parameter changes, like maybe some glitchier ones, you can get some really cool effects this way. So for example, I'm going to go back into live parameter locking recording, and just to be able to hear what it sounds like, I'm going to hold down a chord simultaneously. Okay, so now all those different parameter values about which wavetable we're in are locked to various steps. And so now if I press play and play the keyboard live, we're going to get a very glitchy sound to my playing. So lots of possibilities with that. And if at any moment I decide, I wish I could just switch back to playing the keyboard in this layer without all those parameters, but I don't want to delete them, well, just turn off parameter locking. And now whatever the global level parameter values are for that layer, those will be back in charge. At any time I want, I can turn parameter locking back on. And back off again. So lots of possibilities with that, but what I wanted to do was delete all of that parameter locking data. There we go. And now I want to show you one last thing with the parameter locking, which is this option that we get when this button turns orange. So remember, we toggle between off, green, and orange. Green is parameter locking is on, off is parameter locking is off, and orange is something called sound locking. Now sound locking is a little similar and a little different from everything we've just seen. The way that sound locking works is as I record notes into the sequencer, and we can record them in any method we want. Let's use step recording for example. All of the parameter values that I have set up here, the ones connected to the red knobs and the various parameters for the underlying synth engine and structure are going to get recorded to the step in which I enter the note. So for example, let's start with a sine wave, turn sound locking on. And now I'm going to go to a different wavetable. Let's try, I don't know, that one. And now we'll switch back and forth between the two wavetables from one half of the sequence to the other. And actually I'm going to change this to monophonic for a moment. Okay, so even though I only touched the wavetable parameter knob on steps 1 and 9, the value that I set on step 1 got recorded onto steps 1 through 8, and the value I set on step 9 got recorded on steps 9 through 16, because in sound lock recording mode, all of the red knob parameter values get recorded onto the steps with the notes, wherever the parameter values happen to be when you record those notes. The notes and sound parameter values are bundled together, so to speak. Okay, and I think that'll do it for parameter locking and all the various options it gives us. It's something you can do to spice a track up a bit more, but I do want to emphasize it's something you can do, you don't have to do it. And I often don't bother doing it on a lot of songs I make, and if you look at some of the preset songs that come with the Ambient Zero, a lot of those don't use it either. It's just an option that's available to you, but don't feel like you have to use it in order to get something out of the synth. So I am going to clear this sequence, clear the parameter data, and okay, I think that covers all of the main bases now with note recording, parameter recording, or parameter locking I should say, and various playback options for a specific track. Let's quickly now look at what we can do when we put sequence data into multiple tracks at the same time. And here's where I'm going to finally give you a basic recipe for making songs. And the recipe there's like a main version of it or a foundation to it, and then there's a few different variations and directions you can go with it from there. So let's start with the main aspect of it, the foundation, which is that with our drone layer, I'm going to keep things super simple. I'm literally just going to take a single note. Let's make it a C note, but you can make it whatever note you want. And I'm going to stretch it across the entire sequence. And that's it. That's my whole drone layer taken care of. I'm taking this word drone very literally and making it just a drone, which by definition is just a note that gets sustained for a really long time. And since by default our note value is set to a whole note, or in other words, each step takes a whole note or one whole bar to get through, well, we have 16 steps, so this one note is going to sound for 16 entire bars of music. And so I'm not going to have to worry about it starting over for a long time, but if I want even more reassurance with that, I can increase our note length to 8, which means each of these steps is going to be 8 bars, and 8 times 16 is 128. So we have 128 bars of this note. I think that'll be plenty. If you wanted it even longer, you could extend your sequence length to 64 and tie a note across the entire sequence of 64 steps and have a note that goes on for more than 500 bars, but I think that's a little overkill here. So that's my drone layer. And then with the noise layer, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to take my noise and I'm going to stretch it across the entire sequence. And keep in mind, with both of those, I had tie on, so I'm tying the note across the entire sequence. And then once again, just to give myself a little bit more reassurance, I'm going to set this to 8 bars per step, so this won't get re-triggered for a long time. Okay, now, in and of itself, just having one note go for so long would be pretty boring, but thanks to all the sound design work that we did in the previous video in this series, if we listen to our drone, well, even though it's the same note being sustained, there is a lot of movement to it, and that helps to keep it interesting. And if you want to know how that's happening and why that's happening, check out the previous video in the series where I went over all of that in detail. Okay, so that takes care of our noise and drone layer. And then with the pad layer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a chord progression, a series of chords, one after another, like that would be a 4-chord chord progression, and I play that pretty fast, and that would be a normal speed in something like pop music, but in ambient, we usually want long, sustained chords. And so I'm going to keep that in mind when I sequence this on the sequencer. And then the way I'm going to do this, so there's no like set number of chords that a chord progression has to have. A chord progression can have as many chords in it as you want. It could be as simple as 2 chords going back and forth. Could have 6 chords, 8 chords, a bazillion chords, whatever you want. But a nice number to start with and to default to, I think, is 4 chords. That number 4 keeps reappearing, and it reappears for a reason. It goes back to what I said about 4/4 time, where we have 4 beats per measure. And our sequencer is set up nicely for a 4-chord progression as well, because we have 16 steps, and 16 is divisible by 4. And so we can break up this 16-step sequence into chunks of 4. So steps 1 to 4, I can make 1 chord. Steps 5 to 9, I can make another chord. 9 to 12, I can make a 3rd chord. And 13 to 16, I can make a 4th chord. Now, if you don't know how to play chords or chord progressions, don't worry, because remember what I talked about in the sound design video, where if you have your pitch parameter set to 70, well then each time you press a key, you're going to get both the note of the key that you press and a note that is an interval of a 5th, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, above it. And so it's as if you're playing this, which is a simplified version of a chord known as a dyad. And so I'm going to do that just to make this accessible to everyone. I'm going to do this 1-finger simplified chord, and I'm just going to go here, stretch that across to step 4, and thanks to auto step, I automatically go to step 5, and now I can keep going. I'm going to go down here next, stretch that across to 8, then I've auto stepped to step 9. I'm going to go down here, stretch that across to 12, and then I'm going to go up here and stretch that across from 13 to 16. And so my chord progression is And I say chord progression because some people would argue about whether or not a dyad is truly a chord. I think that functionally it is, and also it doesn't really matter. But it is a simplified chord, and so it can sound a little bit weak. One way to strengthen it is to layer it up in octaves. So I'm going to press up on the octave buttons to go an octave up. And then I'm going to record the same exact sequence again on top of what I already have so that I'm doubling up the chords, the dyads, in octaves. Okay, now let's listen to what we have so far. So we have our continuous drone and noise layer, and we have our little chord progression on the pad layer. This chord progression is going to go nice and slow because we're at the default value of 1 bar per step, and each chord is 4 steps, which means we're going to be sustaining each chord in our sequence for 4 entire bars before going on to the next one. And let's hear what this sounds like. Okay, I think that's working all right, but something that I often like to do with these is instead of having the chord go across all 4 steps of that chunk of 4 that we're splitting our chord progression into, what I sometimes do is I omit the chord from the final step in the chunk. So in this chunk, I'm omitting it from step 4. In this one, I'll omit it from step 8. So I'm just holding down clear and then deleting the chord from that step. And then I'll do the same thing with this next chunk. I'll delete it from step 12. And with this final one, I'll delete it from step 16. And so this way, my chord's going to play for the first 3 steps, and then it's going to start to fade out on the 4th step, and then the next chord will fade in when we get to step 5, and so on and so forth. And you may need to adjust your attack and release values to make this sound right, but let's just hear what it sounds like first, and then see if we need to make any adjustments. Okay, I think that actually worked pretty well. Sometimes you'll find yourself with a release time that's a bit too short. Let's artificially create the situation. And then what's going to happen is the chord's going to fade out too soon, and you're going to go back to silence, and then the next chord will come in, which may or may not be how you want it to sound. Let's hear what that would sound like. Yeah, I kind of liked it more the other way, but this is just personal taste here and really depends on the context of the song you're doing. Okay, so that is the foundational idea. We have a constant drone, a constant noise layer, but with some movement baked into the sound design, and then we have a chord progression on the pad layer. And then with the Atmos layer, there's a few different directions that I'm going to suggest going with this. The first one is to go into step recording mode, or you could do this with live recording or however you want, and just put in a nice little melody or riff or refrain or whatever you want to call it. I just mean something like I've been demonstrating this whole video where I go something like that maybe. And with this one, I'm going to set the note value at a higher value. I want these other layers to be going nice and slow, and then the Atmos layer I would usually have going faster. And I don't know if 1/8 is what I want. Again, I'm not thinking about this mathematically or analytically or anything. I'm just going to listen to how it sounds, and then I'll make an adjustment if I want it to go faster or slower. So let's give this a listen. Okay, and I actually kind of like how that sounds, but I might want to experiment with making it twice as fast. Or with making it twice as slow, so taking our 8th note and cutting it in half to a 4th note. something I like about that version of it is that each time the sequence loops, we're at the start of a new chord. And so the chord changes and this melody line are coinciding with each other. Now, this is a bit repetitious, and that can be okay sometimes, but if we want to vary things up, we have a few options. We could randomize things a bit or use probability. For example, we could bring our probability down a little bit. Let's see what that sounds like. Another thing we could do here is, let's bring that probability back up. We could do what I showed you earlier, where I'm going to increase the length of the sequence, but I'm going to do so by duplicating it by holding down the Shift button and turning the value knob, so that now it's duplicated on all 4 pages. And now I'm going to go to page 2, 3, and 4, and then I'm going to make little changes to the pattern on each page. So I'm just going to replace the first note in the sequence. Instead of going here, I'm going to go down here. And this is going to make it coincide with our chord progression, because remember, that's going. And with our first chord in our progression, we're starting here, both with the chord and with our melodic sequence. And then on page 2, I'm going to replace this with this. And then on page 3, I'm going to replace this with this. And on page 4, I'm going to replace this with this. And let's hear what that sounds like. Okay, I think that works. Now, that was a very simple melodic line. We could do something more complex where we have notes that get tied across steps and we have more rhythmic variety, like, I don't know. But I'm just trying to keep things nice and simple here so that anybody can follow along. And then the final option here is that we can really embrace randomization and turn random sequence on and set this value to, well, you could do whatever you want, but for demonstration purposes, I'm going to set it at 1. And then I'm also going to decrease our probability. Let's do 50 to start off with. Okay, I kind of like that, but I might experiment with some other things here. Like we could try, what if we increased the increment of our step so that we're keeping parts of our original sequence intact with each other? I think that makes it sound a little bit more melodic, whereas when we had it on 1, it was a bit more random beep boop bop. Not that there's anything wrong with random beep boop bop, but I think I like it more the melodic way here. And then we could also mess around with different probabilities. For example, we could lower it. I think that's sounding nice, but another thing I might want to adjust here is my release and attack values and see how that affects our sequence. Let's try increasing the release so that when we have a gap between the notes, the last note rings out for longer. I think I like it more that way. And then I'm also wondering what would happen. Right now we have an ultra short attack. The attack is set at 0. What would happen if we brought this up a little bit so our notes fade in a bit more? I think I like it that way. Having that attack lends a different character to the sound. It's a bit more gentler now. And yeah, like I said in the sound design video, at this point I would be looking at my different layers and probably making little adjustments in things like the level and the filter cutoff, and I might pan things in different directions. And then also, since I brought down our reverb and took off our delay in order to be able to hear things nice and clearly and not have notes linger for too long, now that I have things in place, I might go back and, for example, set this to a larger reverb, put my mix reverb value a bit higher, and bring back just a tad of delay, and let's hear what that sounds like. Our Atmos layer is getting a bit overpowered. I am going to bring up the volume level. And now let's look at a few things related to performing or recording a piece through live performing. And that is that sometimes maybe you want all of your parts to come in all at the same time, as is currently happening when I press play. But usually I'd want things to come in more gradually. I'd want to start with maybe 1 or 2 parts, have the other ones not playing, and then bring them in. And there's a couple ways of doing that. One is that you can mute a track or a layer by pressing function and then pressing the layer that you want to mute. So let's say I just want to have my drone and my noise layers initially. I'm going to mute the pad layer. It says mute on the screen, and I'm going to mute the Atmos layer. And then these turn orange when they're muted, whereas green means it's unmuted. Okay, so now if I press play, we just hear those 2 layers. And then when I want to unmute, I just do the same thing. I press function and then the layer that I want to unmute, and it will say on, meaning that the layer is on, as also indicated by the green light. And so I'm going to mute this again, and then I'm going to unmute these layers after I press play so that I can gradually bring them in. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, but another way, and one that I often prefer to use, is to simply go to the layers that you want to have not playing initially and take their volume level and bring them all the way down to 0 so that they're silent when you press play, and then you can gradually fade them in as the song goes, and I often prefer having that gentler introduction of the layers. So let's hear that. Performance related thing to keep in mind with muting is that, let's say I have the Atmos layer muted and I'll leave the other 3 layers unmuted. If you go to your system settings, so I'm holding function and then pressing the system button, and you go to an option that says mute mode, you have an option here between sound and sequence. And when it's set to sequence, what that means is when you have a layer muted, only the layer is muted. We don't hear anything from the sequence, but I am still able to play the sound of the layer. And this is another thing that I'll often do with the sequencer, and I guess this is another variation of my recipe, which is that you sequence in the other 3 layers so that you have a foundation ready and waiting for you. And then in the Atmos layer, well, you could leave this blank or mute something that you put in there and play live on top of it. That's actually probably my favorite way of making songs on the Ambient Zero, but you can only do it if you have the mute mode set to sequence. If you have it set to sound, then when a layer is muted, well, you can't play it. So just something to bear in mind there. And then one final thing to bear in mind with performing 4 tracks at the same time is that there is a limit to the polyphony, or in other words, the number of voices or notes you can have sounding simultaneously on the Ambient Zero, just like there is on any synthesizer. All synthesizers have some sort of polyphony limit. And on the Ambient Zero, it's a little bit complicated, but basically the limit is usually 10. Or in other words, you can have 10 different notes playing at the same time. Now, the reason it's complicated is because it depends on which structures you're using and which voice mode you're using, unison in particular, because the way that it works is you have 34 oscillator usages that you can use at any given time, and then you have to do a calculation where you have to look at, okay, how many oscillators are there in this structure, how many are there in this structure, this structure, this structure, and the noise layer is equivalent to 2 oscillators, and then you multiply the oscillators by the number of notes you're playing at the same time. So for example, the pad structure uses 3 oscillators, and I have 2 notes going on at any given time. So 2 times 3 is 6. So that's 6 oscillator usages. And then if you have unison mode on, that counts as 4 voices or 4 instances of the same note. So then you do 4 times however many oscillators you have. And anyway, it gets complicated. If you're really interested in this and you want to do the calculations, there's a whole table of information about it in the manual that I would recommend checking out. However, I'm also going to make a little suggestion here, and I'm going to be a little bit more opinionated than I normally am in these videos. And I'm going to suggest to you that if you're reaching the polyphony limit of the ambient 0, it's probably a sign of a deeper problem than not having enough voices available to you. And the problem is probably that you're overcrowding your composition. I've made about 50 songs on this thing. I think I've run into the voice limit maybe 1 time in all of those songs. And the thing is just, if you have too many notes going on at the same time, it just doesn't sound good usually. It just sounds overcrowded. This song that we're playing right now has, 1 note on the drone layer, 2 on the pad layer, 1 on the Atmos layer, 1 on the noise. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm only getting halfway through the average limit on the voice count. And yet I think we have a pretty full sounding arrangement here, despite only using 5 notes at a given time. And we still have plenty of room to work with here. I could add more and more notes to the pad layer. As long as I'm not adding 6 more, I should be safe. Personally, I wouldn't want to go any higher than that, but just be aware that if you do go a bit higher than that in terms of how many notes you're playing at the same time, you might run into the polyphony limit. And then don't worry, it's not like your ambient 0 is going to explode if you do. Instead, it's just going to start dropping notes from what's getting played, and it will prioritize them. Anyways, like I said, it's complicated. It's in the manual. Go read about it more there if you're interested, but also you probably don't have to worry about it. Now there's just a few little odds and ends to look at here. First of all, let's assume I'm happy with what I have right now. It would probably be a very good idea to save it, and the way I do that is by holding down the function button, pressing pattern, and then I can choose a different save location if I want. So right now I'm in P803. I could go over to P804 or P802, but if I want to save in the current location, I can just not do anything here and just press OK wherever I want to save my pattern, and it'll say done. To do that again real quick, I go function, pattern, and then just press OK if I want to just save to the current location. Whereas if I want to change the location, I go function, pattern, and then I select a different location, like the one right before our current location, press OK, and now I've created 2 different copies of my pattern palette, which can be useful if you want to duplicate it and maybe work on different versions of it. Now, P803 is not exactly the most memorable name, so I'm going to rename it, and the way we do that is by pressing function, and then this button here, which is labeled pattern. We can then select the pattern that we want to rename. If you just want to rename the one you're in, you don't have to do anything. You just press OK, and then you'll see the first character start to blink. You toggle between the characters using the octave arrows, and then you change the character using the value knob, and you can choose between letters and numbers. I'm going to call this demo, so I'm going to go over to the next letter, and then in between each character you can have a period or no period, and you can toggle on and off like that. I'm just going to leave no period in, go to the next letter, change that to an M, go to the next one, change that to an O, and there we go. Press OK, and it'll say done, it's saved. And now at this point, you're still in pattern renaming mode. You can use the volume knob to choose a different pattern to rename. Like there's my copy of P803 that I created a moment ago. But if I just want to get out of here, I press cancel, and then I've exited the pattern naming setting. And then one other thing to be aware of is that you can take any layer of your song and you can copy it by first selecting the layer that you want to copy and then pressing function and then this button here, which is labeled copy underneath. It'll say copy on the screen, and you can paste it anywhere you want. You could paste it into another layer within the same pattern palette that you're already in, or by pressing the pattern button and then turning the value knob, you can navigate to a different pattern, like the next one in my bank, which I'm pretty sure is empty. And so now to paste into this layer, I'm going to press function and then this button here, which is labeled paste, and it'll say done. It is done pasting. And now I've copied and pasted that entire layer into this layer of my empty palette. And if I just want to have the sound for this pattern, let's say I want to recycle this sound for a new song, I can just clear the note information by pressing clear, pattern, leave it on note, and press OK. And now all the note information is gone, but our sound is still there. Do keep in mind though that your sequencer is going to be set the same way as it was when you pasted it. So for example, if I want to go back to the default whole note setting and the default length, I'm going to have to make those changes. And now I can start working on a new song with this old sound. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to quickly put in a little pattern here. And I'm going to save that. I am going to rename it. I'm going to call this Demo 2. I'm going to decrease the note, make it real quick on all of the layers for reasons that I will explain in a moment. And I'm going to save that again. Okay, so now we have this ultra short pattern palette. It's just going to go. Oh, notice how the probability data was saved as well. I forgot to reset that. So I'm going to save it again. Okay, so really fast pattern palette, and the reason I've made this is because there's one last thing I want to show you, which is that you can chain different patterns together. And the way we do this is we press the pattern button twice, and then the step sequencer is now representing the different memories within the current bank that we're in. So if I press 4, for example, well, that's where I saved Dem 2, 3 is where I saved Demo, 2 is where I saved that copy of P803, and so on and so forth. And notice how the steps are getting lit up. That's because what I'm doing right now is I'm programming the order that I want these sequences to be chained together. And if I want to get rid of something, I just press the button again, and then I can start over. And so we can do whatever we want here. Like I have this song I named Autumn here, and I could start with Autumn, and then go to Demo, and then go to P803, and then Demo 2, or whatever I want. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to go straight from Demo 2, which remember is super, super short, to Demo. And then the way this is going to work is when I press play, it's going to play through the first pattern once, get to the end of it, and since it's super short, that's going to not take much time. And then it's going to go to the next sequence in the chain, and the next one, and the next one if I included more. But let's just do it with 2 and hear what that would sound like. So we play through one pattern palette sequence and then the next one. Now that I've shown you that, I can explain one last little nuance here, which is that with our BPM, we have both a pattern BPM, which is the primary function or parameter of this knob, and we have a global level BPM, which is the secondary parameter of the same knob. And so for example, I'm going to set the global BPM at 40, and then my pattern is at 80. What that's in place for is if you press the function button and then this button here, which says BPM, you can toggle between pattern and global. And what that's saying is which BPM is the sequencer going to defer to? Is it going to use the pattern specific BPM, which might be 40 for one pattern, 80 for another, 120 for yet another, or is it going to use the global BPM, which is going to always be whatever I set it at, 40 in this case. And that's useful in pattern chaining because it allows you to play things at the same BPM if that's what you want to do. So I can go 4 and then 3 to do the same chain that we did before, only now the global BPM is going to be the one in charge, and so we're going to go at 40 BPM instead of 80 BPM. All right, so that was the final thing I wanted to cover in this video. I know that was a lot to get through. I've almost lost my voice at this point, but please don't feel like you need to understand and remember every single little thing. You really don't. I know that from experience. To make a little confession here, I've had this synth for a number of months now. I've made 50 songs on it. I've made these videos for SONICWARE and my own YouTube channel. I've had other SONICWARE devices in the past, and I'm familiar with how they generally work. And yet, despite all of that, there are things about the sequencer that I didn't learn until I sat down to make this video. For example, I didn't know how pattern chaining worked because I've never felt the need to do it before. It's a really useful thing if you want to perform sets of songs, or if you want to create complex multi-section songs, but I just haven't gotten around to doing that yet. And I think that's the way I would frame all of this. A lot of these things that I've shown you are just various options that are available to you if and when the time comes, if it ever comes, and you want them or need them. But you may not want them or need them. I made my first collection of songs on the sequencer without knowing quite a few of the things we've gone over in this video, but that didn't stop me from making them, and I don't want it to stop you from making music either. The best way to learn isn't to just watch a video like this until you know every single thing there is to know, but to just go and get your hands on the sequencer, try things out, make mistakes, figure out how to fix them, and just improve your knowledge from there. This video, and this whole series of videos, is just to get you started on your journey, and I wish you the best of luck on that journey. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.